Mga kasama, welcome and good morning to everyone to the SocDem Asia webinar series on building the momentum for change. I'm Justin. I'm the Secretary General for Akbayan Youth, and I'll be your moderator for this morning. And we are so lucky to have the former national organizing team of the Bernie Sanders campaign to talk about the distributed organizing program.
Good morning, everyone. And good evening to our speakers. To the comrades from Akbayan, magandang umaga. We have a very diverse audience, but all shares the passion for social change. I'm happy to see that there are so many provinces from north to south of Philippines tuning with us today. And I know that there are registrants from Malaysia, Mongolia, Indonesia, Nepal, Thailand, who will also tune in or are already here with us this morning. The Bernie Sanders campaign is a disruption. It is also something that we look into as we study different campaigns that inspires mobilization of citizens and especially young people. When we come across the article of our resource persons this morning, we were inspired not only that they are all women, but also they have been passionate about their work on how they run their campaign. And this is something for us in these very challenging times. We would want to connect with different youth organizations and political parties from the member parties of SocDem Asia. And we know that that cannot happen without organizing and campaign. Our mentors from our party would always remind us about the importance and the non-negotiability of organizing. So we look into that campaign in the US of progressives for its consistency, for its passion, for its capturing the imagination of new generation who wants change. And we look into the team who run these campaigns to learn from them because we believe that it is only through liberative education and through really relentless collective action that we will pursue a strategic project of change. But the project of transformative change takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of courage to be able to say that we will forge ahead and we will still move forward.
Let's get it on. Thank you so much. We are very excited to be here tonight, and I love that you said, Marcus, that the Bernie campaign was disruptive. This presentation is about distributed organizing, but distributed organizing is disruptive in the sense that it is a relatively new form of organizing, both for elections and for movements and in the advocacy space. And so we're really excited to share the lessons that we learned on the campaign with all of you today. All right, so I'm just going to run through tonight's agenda quickly. We're going to have three main sections of our agenda. First, we will talk about what is distributed organizing, define it, give a big picture overview of what that means. Next, we'll move on to how to build a distributed system. And of course, we are going to be relying heavily on examples from the Bernie Sanders campaign, which is where most of us got the majority of our distributed organizing experience. So we'll be sharing a lot of examples from Bernie, but please know that we are very confident that all of the examples that we go through can be applicable to you and the campaigns you run as well. So we will use the Q&A section to talk through any questions that you have and help to hopefully figure out how these lessons on distributed organizing that we took from the campaign and are sharing with you can be applied to your work in Asia. So that is our agenda. If you have questions throughout the program, please either type them in the chat and we'll try to monitor them, or just post them in the Q&A box, which was mentioned earlier, should be at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those during the Q&A section. So that is tonight's agenda, and now I'm going to kick things off by talking about distributed organizing and what that actually is and what it means. So we like to think about distributed organizing as a mindset shift. It's not a tool. A tool is something you can pick up and put down, right? A mindset requires some rewiring to how you think about things and how you approach problems, changes, and how you approach staffing and your volunteer structure changes. And as we know, it's a framework, so it's up to you to take the mindset and then get creative within the context of your campaign or your organization to create your goals and your vision. So this is our working definition. You are empowering your volunteers when you do distributed organizing to take on staff level work, and we're going to talk more about that. We have very big goals when it comes to the work that we do, and so much of achieving those goals relies on believing in volunteers to be a part of the movement, and so we empower them to take on the most important work of the movement. So it's a full embrace of the idea that we can't get to the level of scale that we need. We can't be talking to as many people, for example, and growing our movement as big as we need to win if we don't radically entrust the work that we need to get done to the people who are not staff in our movements. They are everyday people, and they're volunteers. So what you're going to see in the examples that we lay out tonight is that working at scale changes how you organize. You'll need to be constantly thinking about building and maintaining teams of volunteers. You'll depend on automating things as much as you can, much more than you might have done otherwise. And you'll need to systematize key skills and information into trainings and written materials so that they can be used over and over again. And those are some of the steps that we're going to get more into today. So now I'm just going to lay out a little bit about why we think distributed organizing is so important and helpful to do, again, in pretty much every context. So first of all, the number one way to get someone to vote for your candidate or to care about your issue is to have conversations with them, right? So I remember the first time that I was contacted by a canvasser, for example, and was able to really share the issues that I cared about in the upcoming election, and ultimately was moved in some part by that conversation to vote for the candidate that canvasser was there representing. And so again, we need to have millions of conversations ultimately to win elections. And that was the case for Bernie. We needed to win millions of votes. And in order to do that, we needed to have conversations with hundreds of millions of voters. The Bernie campaign staff, that said, had about 500 people. So even if all of those 500 people had spent 12 hours all day, every day, having conversations with voters, we wouldn't have been able to have as many conversations as we needed to win hundreds of millions of votes for Bernie. And that meant that we needed to empower thousands of Bernie supporters to do that volunteer work and voter contact work with us. So that was the responsibility of the national organizing team. We built systems that allowed us to recruit, train, and support volunteers all over the country to have these conversations with voters from the comfort of their homes. So no matter where you were able to have a meaningful role in the election. And that's the only way that we were able to have hundreds of millions of conversations with voters that we needed to have. So basically, in order to scale, we need to, what we call distributize the organizing work we need to get done. So distribute it all across the country and make sure that anyone, anywhere can get involved. And we needed to deputize or empower volunteers to do this work and then support them every step of the way. So that is the why of distributed organizing. And so again, this presentation is going to be more of the details about how we actually do it, but big picture, what we do is we build and run remote volunteer teams of all different types to accomplish all the work that needs to get done. And as I've been saying, this requires radical trust and empowerment in volunteers. So with that, I'm going to pass things off to Emily to say a little bit more and continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Shayna. So this, type of distributed organizing makes a lot of sense in an electoral context. When you're trying to win an election, it's very clear what the goal is. It's to get the most votes. And that means getting enough voters out for your candidate. So it's very easy to come up with goals for our volunteers about what we want to accomplish. But this model of organizing can be applied in many different contexts, not just electoral, not just about winning elections. If you can really get clear on what are our goals, what are we trying to accomplish, whether it's calls to politicians, if it's trying to win legislative fights or do labor organizing or student organizing. If you have a clear objective, you can apply this model of organizing. But it's particularly effective in elections. So on the Bernie campaign, we accomplished so much, and we're so proud of what we accomplished. And we're sharing right now some of the numbers and the metrics that we achieved on the campaign to demonstrate how much you can scale an operation using this model of organizing. So the first number you'll see here is 1.5 million relational contacts. That's all about people reaching out to their friends about Bernie. Relational organizing is just friends reaching out to friends. And so our supporters mapped out relationships. They told the campaign, hey, these are the friends and the family and the people in my life who I will talk to about Bernie and I will commit to bring out to vote for Bernie. So that happened 1.5 million times. We also, the program that Claire ran, we ran an amazing campus program where we recruited 5,000 students across 2,600 campuses to become really dedicated leaders on their campus to get out the vote among young people. So these are really impressive numbers, and the only way that we could ever accomplish this is by deeply empowering volunteers to do the most critical work of the campaign. And sometimes that's not always the most glamorous work of the campaign, but we needed to build well-run systems to make this work happen, not only at a huge scale, but good quality as well. So, yes, okay, so these are some of the ways that we measure our success is by what we call voter contact attempts. So one method of measuring that is by door knocks. So we knocked almost 7 million doors, and we called people 50 million times, which is a lot, and sent nearly over a quarter billion text messages. So these are, again, huge numbers. We never could have done that without distributed organizing. And a huge part of distributed organizing is technology. And I know on this screen we're displaying to you the different tools that we use to achieve our goals. And this can seem really overwhelming, but they were integral to our program. So the first thing you'll see here is the dialer. This is our phone bank tool. It's the way that volunteers across the country could immediately get onto their computer and start talking to voters. This was, again, an automated process where you could sign up and immediately you're on the phone with voters, persuading them to support Bernie Sanders. The other thing we did was Burn. The Burn app was an app that our supporters could download onto their phone and could map out their relationships to other voters, relational organizing, and send text messages to their friends and families really quickly and at a huge scale. So we made it really easy for people to give the most important information to their friends and family. We used a tool called Spoke to allow our volunteers to send, like I said, over 250 million text messages. So this is a really cool tool that Coley managed, where volunteers could go like click, click, click like this, and each time they clicked, they'd send a text message and initiate a conversation with the voter. I won't go through all of this, but you can just see here how we built a technical system to support the work that we did. So you might have tools that are similar to these tools, and we're happy to talk through tools with you offline. But it's really important to figure out what are the resources, the digital tools that we have to make and build these systems. So with that, I will pass it to Claire to talk about building distributed systems.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. So excited. So for the next 20 or 25 minutes, Hannah and I are going to dig in with all of you to go over the step-by-step process of how you build a distributed organizing system and a volunteer team to go along with it. So there are 4 steps to this process that we're going to go over, and these are basically the key steps for how to identify a problem that you're trying to solve within your campaign or organization, or a piece of work that you need to get done, and to get it done in a distributed way with powered by a group of volunteers, and in the process build the capacity of volunteer leadership so they can take on more and more things, and we're putting the work in more and more hands. So as Hannah and I talked through these 4 steps, we're going to use so these are the 4 steps that we are about to go through. Step 1 is to identify the work you need to get done, or the problem that you want to solve for your organization or campaign. Step 2 is to build the infrastructure you need to empower volunteers to accomplish that piece of work. Step 3 is to recruit and train volunteers to do that work and run the systems. And step 4 is staff's role becomes supporting volunteers to do that work. So I will go over step 1, and then Hannah will take you through steps 2, 3, and 4. All right, so step 1, again, is to identify a piece of work that your organization needs accomplished, or a problem that you need to solve. So the problem that we had, one of the problems we faced on the Bernie campaign about 6 months or so into the campaign, maybe even a little less, 4 or 5 months, was that, so we had this phone banking program where volunteers signed up to every day make phone calls to voters about Bernie, to have those critical conversations that we know help encourage people who are undecided about who they want to support, get on board to support Bernie, or for people who already know they want to support Bernie, great, then we recruit them to volunteer. So we had a group of volunteers making these phone calls, but those volunteers who were signing up to make those phone calls weren't showing up consistently or regularly to do it. A lot of them would sign up for a phone banking shift and then would not actually show up for it. So, and it meant that we weren't able to predict how many calls we were going to be able to make to voters that day, and make sure that we were going to have the capacity to make enough calls. You can go to the next slide. So the solution was that, let's go there. Awesome. That we decided to build a team of volunteers who would actually make calls first thing in the morning to all of the volunteers who were signed up to do a phone banking shift that day. It's a little meta, it's volunteer to volunteer calling. So again, we had a team of volunteers who called other volunteers to make sure that they were going to show up for their shift and they were ready and excited and had everything they needed. So we made these confirmation calls every morning to say, you know, we're so glad that you're signed up to make phone calls for Bernie this afternoon at 2 p.m. Are you ready to go? Do you have any questions? Do you need me to go over how to use the dialer, the calling tool that we used, etc.? And it let people know that we were counting on them to show up and excited, and we were going to be there to support them every step of the way. And it made it a lot more likely that they were actually going to show up and make those critical phone calls to voters during the time of their shift that afternoon. We also, the next day, called them back and said, how did your phone banking shift go? How were your conversations with voters? And can I get you signed up for your next shift? So we called those confirmation calls and reshifting calls. So we had basically this specialized team of amazing volunteers, and we titled the team the Advanced Call Team to let them know this was kind of next level work. And them making these calls to confirm and reshift volunteers really made the much larger phone banking program, which was made up of thousands of volunteers, possible, and made it more consistent and effective, and let us know that we were going to do the amount of voter outreach that we needed to do on a given day. Eventually, this team was so successful that they started making a whole lot of other types of phone calls as well, but we will just focus on this purpose originally intended specifically as a support team for the larger calling program. And you can go to the next slide. So when you are applying step 1 to your campaign or organization or your context, here are some of the questions that we would recommend asking yourself to think through to accomplish step 1. So the first one is, what are your organization's goals? If you could dream as big as you wanted to in terms of scale. Secondly, what support systems do you need to build for your organization or campaign to accomplish those large goals? For us, the advanced call team was one of them. Third, what are some of the pain points and problems that you are trying to address in your organizing? And if you had a targeted infusion of volunteer power, could that help address it? Our answer was yes, and that's why we built this team. And lastly, how can you build support structures into every part of the organizing life cycle? So when you're recruiting volunteers, confirming them, and getting them signed up for their next shift in order to take all of your organization-wide to the next level. And I will see if Hannah wants to add anything, and otherwise she's going to take it away through the rest of the steps.
Nope, that was awesome. Thank you, Claire. And Claire actually gets all the credit for starting this team. And then we ran it together for a while, which was really, really fun. So I am going to cover steps 2 through 4 of this process of building a volunteer team to support whatever work you need done. I think Claire set us up really well. We know we need to start by answering the general question of what work needs to be done. And so now I'm going to talk you through how we actually do that. And the first step in that is building your infrastructure. So what that means is all of the physical tools and systems that your volunteers will need to go through in order to actually complete the work. So the first part of this, as I said, is sort of designing a workflow and building the tech infrastructure around that flow. So you'll see on the right-hand side of this slide is a picture of what we called the Advanced Call Team Hub, right? The sort of communications place where volunteers could figure out exactly what work needed to be done, where they could do the work, and then where they could tell us that the work was completed. So from here on out, I'll refer to our Advanced Call Team as ACT. That's just the little acronym we used for them. So you'll see in this spreadsheet, which was in Google Sheets, there are 5 columns that you can see here. The ACT caller's name, so that would be the person who is actually making these calls. They would go ahead and put their name there to say, I'm going to claim this row, I'm going to make this call. They would put the date next to it, and then they would click on the little contact method column and tell us how they were contacting the person. So we all know the answer to this, it's a phone call. The reason that we had different examples here is because we wanted to make sure that if they didn't pick up, we could send them a follow-up text. So you could also mark in there that you texted them. And then you'll see the rest of the columns are the ways that you actually find the person's number and the name of the person you're calling. But this was really important because it allowed the members of the team to know what volunteer to call when, what to say on the call, right? What the actual script, where to record the results, and where to go if they needed help or had questions. I would say before we move on, the most important thing here is that we were able to automate and systematize as much as possible. So for example, we weren't doing things like figuring out who to call every single day, right? We worked with our data department and created a system that would just tell us who needed to be called every day, and then that would show up in this spreadsheet. So as much as possible when you're trying to grow your team, you want to automate. All right. Okay. The second part of that is after actually doing the work, the volunteers needed to be able to talk with each other. And for this, we used Slack, which was our communications platform. We were going to talk a little bit more about Slack later, but it was basically the digital workspace for our entire organizing program. And you'll see here, this is a message that one of our volunteer moderators, so kind of the like lead volunteers, would write in Slack to tell volunteers what the work was for today. So you'll see it's, a motivational post with a couple of quick tips. We would also have these kind of posts at the beginning and end of every shift, and we will talk about this a lot more later, but I think it's important for us to think about not just where the work gets done, which is in Google Sheets, but also how volunteers talk about the work with each other, and that was in Slack. Okay.
Now, the most important part is actually building the infrastructure to teach people how to actually do the work. So we needed to create the materials to train volunteers to actually use these amazing systems that we built. So it's not just like, here's a Google sheet, go crazy. It was a series of guides and materials that would actually show people how to do the work well and how to do it efficiently. So what that looked like on the Bernie 2020 campaign was a series of team guides. So you'll see here's a picture of the Bernie 2020 Advanced Call Team Guide. And this was basically a really long Google Doc where we sort of wrote out all of the steps of how to do the work. So you'll see in the table of contents, there's some good hints in there of what we covered in the guide. One thing I really want to highlight here is that we didn't just talk about how to actually do the work. We also talked about why the work was important, right? So grounding people in sort of, why are you spending your free time making calls to strangers? Like, why does that matter? Why is that important? And I know every single person on this call is on here for a reason. And so you know how to get volunteers motivated, but that is really, really important. We're going to talk about that a little more later, but I just really wanted to highlight that. So for us on this team specifically, we had a team guide, one for the volunteers and one for the volunteer leads, right? They were still volunteers, but they were kind of the moderators who were kind of answering a lot of questions. And then we would also have an FAQ or, individual docs to answer specific questions for specific assignments. And then the last part that we had were these weekly team calls where volunteers could get together for 1 hour a week and see each other's faces. Part of distributed organizing is that you're all in different places across the country or across the world or across a province. And it can feel really lonely and really isolating to be doing this work by yourself. And so we tried our best to create some intentional time for community where people could come together, they could share how their weeks were going, they could talk about the kind of work that they were doing, and us as staff could use that time also to impart some important lessons and prepare them for the week ahead. So here's the work that's coming up. Let's talk about a couple of things that we think we can improve upon. Can somebody share a story about the best call they had this week? That kind of stuff. So we found this to be an incredibly important part of our infrastructure because it allowed volunteers to actually connect with other volunteers, and that's movement building, right? Is when volunteers get a chance to meet other like-minded people and they don't feel so alone. So these were some of my favorite parts were the team calls. Okay, and then the key questions, I kind of like this framework for talking about it as we're moving through step 2, the building the systems and infrastructure is, and again, feel free to take pictures of this. I think this is really important. The questions you want to ask yourself are, how can we design a very simple process, right? This should not be complicated. You should be able to explain it to your baby cousin in 5 minutes, right? Like step 1, you get on the phone. Step 2, you call the person. Step 3, things like that. And then the second part of that is, how can we design a workflow that puts as much of the process in the hands of volunteers as possible? So basically, how can you do as little work as possible? We used to talk on the Bernie campaign about organizing yourself out of a job, right? You want to make it as easy as possible for other people to do the work. So you can just sit back and hang out with your sparkling water. I'm just kidding. There's always work to be done, but you want to make sure that you're empowering people to do that work for you. And then finally, what information do volunteers need to be given to actually complete the work, right? So that's the guides, the team calls, all the sort of trainings that we would give them. And how can we make sure they feel supported, right? So how can we talk to them? How can we make sure that they get their questions answered, that they feel motivated to do this work? And then always, the last question here, are there opportunities to further automate and systematize the process? So again, how can you just keep getting better and doing less work? All right, so step 3. So if step 1 is figuring out what we need to do, step 2 is building the systems to do it. Step 3 is to actually get the people who are going to do this work. So what that looked like for us, and Shana, you can kind of click through whatever makes sense as I'm talking. What that looked like for us was we broke it down here to like a 3-step process. But we would start with a monthly text blast. So Coley's volunteers would send out, thousands of text messages to people who had signed up saying they were interested in volunteering for Bernie. And we would usually set a goal number. So we would say, we'd like to have 200 people to say yes to volunteering. At each step of the process, we would assume that we would lose about 50% of the people. This is really normal. I know sometimes it can feel like maybe you're not doing your job if people aren't showing up or people are dropping off, but that's totally normal. So we would just say at every step, we're going to assume that about 50% of the people won't show up. So from that monthly text blast, right, we would send a text that said, hey, do you want to join a special volunteer team for Bernie? 200 people would say yes. We would say, great, sign up for this training webinar where you'll learn how to do the work. We'd get, let's say, 100 people to sign up for that webinar, right? So that's 200 people who say yes, 100 people who sign up, and then we'd probably get 50 to actually attend the webinar. So we would put the webinar on, we would say, welcome to the team, thank you so much, here's how you do the work, blah, 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 here's the guides, here's how you make a phone call. So we'd have about 50 people on there, and from there, we'd, again, divide by 2 and get about 25 in our Slack workspace. So in the place where we would actually communicate with them. So once we had those 25 recruits in Slack, we would make sure they would sign up for their first shifts. We always encouraged our volunteers to sign up for shifts. This is a very normal organizing practice. And of those 25 who we fully onboarded, we would expect somewhere between 15 and 20 to stick around. So again, that's assuming, a 50% drop-off rate at every part of the process. Key questions to ask yourself here are, how many volunteers do I need, right? Some teams you might need 100 to 200 people, right? At the end of the advanced call team, we had about 500 volunteers making calls, but that didn't all happen in one go, right? It was a slow build. That we needed. And then there were some teams where you only need 10 people, right? 10 really specialized folks. So make sure you're answering that question honestly. The worst thing you can do is have too many people and not enough work. And followed shortly by too much work, not enough people, right? But that's a solvable problem. So we know how to do that. The second question is, again, hearkening back to step 2, what key information and skills do volunteers need to know how to do this work? So how are they going to get trained? How are you going to teach them? And that's all the things we've talked about, the guides, the team calls, these onboarding webinars, sort of the introduction to the work. And then the third question is, how can they get started right away? One really key important part of distributed organizing is you don't want people to wait. You want people to be able to get started right now. So if they are on the webinar, by the end of the training webinar, you want them to be making calls, right? You want them to get started, because once they see how to do it, they will realize how impactful it is, how important it is, and they will want to get started. So whatever flow you design for your system, you want to make sure that people have the opportunity to get started right away. Not come back tomorrow and we'll get started then. Nope, by the end of the call, people should be doing the work. Okay, and then the last and final step is to support volunteers to do the work and consistently improve the system. So once all of this work has been done, the system kind of runs itself through the volunteers. That's a mark of a good distributed team. It is a lot of work up front, but then as you go, you can kind of take your hands off the wheel a little bit and let the system run itself. That's how you'll know that you're doing a good job, is you do less and less work every single day. So at that point, the main role of the staff person is to, 1, provide support to the volunteers and ensure quality control, right? So we want to make sure that if volunteers have questions, they get answers. We want to make sure that, they're not saying wild things on the phones, that they're not sending text messages that, say crazy things about Bernie. We want to make sure that they're actually doing the work correctly. So that's your job. And then the second part is continuing to innovate and improve the system. So as volunteers do the work, you will realize things that you didn't realize before about how to make it better. So, maybe you figure out a way to get more people onto your calls. Do that, right? Maybe you find a way to make your calls quicker. Do that, right? And it involves a lot of trial and error and making mistakes and trying new things and launching things that then don't work, or launching things that maybe were harder to do than you expected, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you're failing. What it means is that you're trying new things, and that's how you grow, right? Is through that innovation. And then finally, the last part of this, the last part of your job, once you've kind of birthed your distributed child into the world, is to just keep going, right? So just keep adding volunteers into the system and keep improving it. So as you attract more and more volunteers, and as you bring them into your system, you are going to be able to get to know them and figure out what unique skills and goals and passions they actually bring to this project. And then you'll be able to give them more and more work, right? It's your job it's like parenting. You want to release control as they get older, right? So at first you're going to be in there a lot, making sure they're doing things, editing your guides, building new systems. And then as the team gets older, you'll be able to step back and say, actually, this volunteer is really amazing. Why don't you update the guide, right? Why don't you lead the webinars? Why don't you send the text messages, right? Things like that. So that's really the key piece of distributed that I think a lot of people don't understand. And it's actually in the title of the work. You want to distribute the work so that you're not doing everything. As organizers, it's really tempting to say, I can do this, I can solve this problem, I can take this on. But what's so beautiful about this system is that it really does build movements, and it empowers ordinary people to take on responsibility and move that into the future. One example before we move on from the advanced call team is on our last call, we had a team member who showed up and was devastated that Bernie had dropped out. But she said she had never made a political phone call before this campaign. She had spent 3 months doing it on the advanced call team, and she actually had just started an organizing network in her area to organize nurses and doctors around the coronavirus pandemic through calling them. So it was really amazing that she felt so empowered by the systems that we had built to go forward and organize herself. And that's how we're going to win power in the end. Okay. I am going to talk very quickly, I feel like I'm running a little behind on time, about support and accountability for these volunteers. So what does it look like to actually be a volunteer on one of these teams? Probably you guys are thinking, wow, you'll be doing a lot of work. It'll be really scary. And what I will say is that your volunteers are only as good as the support that you give them. So some of the key ways that we provided support to the advanced call team was through our digital workspace, right? Through Slack. So there are a few options out there for digital communication, but you're going to need something that's actually effective for getting the work done. So one of the things that we built as part of this system was, I've mentioned them a few times, were normal volunteers and then our volunteer moderators, kind of our advanced volunteer leads. And these were people who, as they started to do the volunteer work, we would notice that they were maybe exceptionally good at making phone calls. Maybe they were just around a lot, right? Maybe they just had 10 hours a day to commit to this. Maybe they were extremely motivating and kind in Slack. Whatever quality you're looking for, those are the people that you can then elevate to be the next step up. You can basically give them a promotion and make them moderators. And we found that was really effective in making people feel bought into the system, right? Once they feel like it's their system, they will work much harder and much smarter because they'll feel like it's theirs, that they own it. And so as much as possible, we try to, again, distribute the work down to volunteers and empower them to make those decisions. The other things on here, I've talked a little bit about team calls, but one thing I really want to highlight is the shift schedule. So on the team calls, we would encourage, we would have a time where volunteers could sign up for their shifts in the upcoming week. And then we would hold them accountable. So one way we would do that is through the volunteer moderators, right? Messaging individual volunteers and saying, hey, we noticed you signed up for a shift. Can you still make it? That kind of stuff. So we found that by having people sign up for their shifts, they felt like they had already committed to be there, and so they would show up. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about team culture. So all of the things that I've been talking about through the first 3 steps are only possible when people want to show up, right? Volunteers don't want to do volunteer work if they don't feel like they're making a difference and if it's not fun. And so those are the 2 things that you need to always be highlighting, are how your work is impacting what we're doing and making it fun. So ways we would do this are through, obviously a lot of things I've talked about, through Slack, on our team calls, things like that. But you'll see in this picture on the side, you'll notice these bells that people have posted, these emoji bells. So that was something that we created for volunteers to post every time they got someone to say yes to a shift, right? So if you call someone, you say, hey, we see you're signed up to make phone calls for Bernie today at 3 p.m. Can I confirm that you're going to be there? The person on the other end would say, yes, I can be there at 3 p.m. Then as the caller on ACT, you would post a bell in the chat and say, I got someone, yay! And then everyone would emoji it and celebrate it, and there would be bells everywhere. And it's really amazing for people to see how their work comes together, right? To build this incredible movement. So you'll see in this screenshot alone, there's 7 bells. So that's 7 hours of calling. Let's say you make on the dialer 100 calls an hour. That's 700 calls that are going out for Bernie Sanders that's between 3:01 p.m. and 3:09 p.m. In 8 minutes, that's 700 calls going out for our movement, for the progressive left and for Bernie as our next president. And so when volunteers see that, they see the power of their work and they feel motivated to do more, right? They're like, oh, I want to get another bell. I want to get another bell. I'm going to stay later and call more. So that was really important. You'll also see one other example. Yay, Justine gets it. He's posting bells in the chat. Amazing. One other thing that you'll see here on this screenshot, which is why it's so good, is you'll see Kara saying she's signing in. So, and you'll see Chuck saying he's signing off. So that is a really important part of Slack culture and of team culture, is we need to know who's doing the work and when they're doing it, right? You can sign up on the shift schedule, but I still want to know that you're making calls between 3 and 4 p.m. or 2 and 3 p.m. or 2 and 5 p.m. or whatever it is. So part of our training and part of the things that we would talk about in the onboarding webinar, in the guides, things we would remind people to do on team calls, was to announce when they were signing in and when they were signing out. So you'll see our volunteers are following it very well there. And then, they get special like waving emojis and heart emojis. And you can't see from this, but in our Slack, they all moved. So it was kind of like a little bit seizure inducing, but it was a very fun place to be for like a work thing. So that might seem like a small thing, but it's really, really, really important to create a shared language amongst the people who are doing the work, right? So that when they see a bell, they know like, oh, that's a Bernie thing, right? Or like when we would get on team calls, people would say, I got 10 bells in this shift. And a normal person would be listening to that saying, what the heck? What's a bell? What's a shift, right? But they know what it's about, and that makes them feel like a team, and it makes them feel like they're working together to create something bigger, which is what organizing is about. And that's how people feel excited and empowered and like they're making a difference. I think the number one reason people stop volunteering is not because they get busy or because they lose interest. It's because they don't feel like they're contributing. And so if you can show people very tangibly how they're contributing, that is really important. It is a little bit like Animal Crossing, Ella. So yes, you nailed it. And there are a million ways to do this, right? This is just one example, but I would really encourage all of you as you're building these systems to be creative about what that looks like and how you can celebrate success on your teams. Okay, one last thing I want to say here before we move on is this is how it looked in Slack, right? In the place where we communicated with each other. But there are other ways that you can do this in other places. So one really obvious way is I don't know how much like indoor cycling is a thing in Asia, but if you've ever heard of Soul Cycle or Flywheel, you know, you get on your little indoor bike and you pedal for an hour, and it's like exercise, and you know, you burn like 1,000 calories or whatever. But one of the cool things about those exercise studios is that there's actually leaderboards at the front of the room who tell you who's going fastest and who's like bicycling the most. And so one of the things that we would do on our various teams is create leaderboards where volunteers could see how many calls they had made that week, or how many hours, whatever it is you want to highlight. That's what I would encourage you to put on the leaderboard. So, you know, maybe we're tracking bells, and then, you know, Carter can put that he got 2 bells at 3 o'clock or whatever. And then at the end of the week on the team call, you can look at the team leaderboard and say, wow, Carter got 600 bells this week. That's amazing. That's 600 shifts for Bernie, which means that's, you know, 6,000 calls, which means, you know, our movement is growing and we're going to win and all of those good things. So bells and accountability, but also leaderboards were really effective. Okay. Last thing here is the key, oh, wow, okay. The key questions to ask during step 4. I'm gonna go over this quickly. 1, where do volunteers go if they have questions? How will they get answers, right? So if people are like, what's a bell, right? Where do they ask that? You need to create a system for that. Any question that a volunteer has means that you should create a system for it. How do volunteers actually do the work? How are you gonna know if the work is complete, right? How are you actually gonna know if they've made the calls, right? You need to figure that out. For us, a bell was a really good example of that. 3, do you need to keep scaling and growing? Well, you need to replace people as they drop off. So the reason we kept growing ACT is because we needed to make more calls. So we just kept growing. But if you need to make less calls, then you don't need to do that. And then how can you ensure that good volunteers stick around? How can you best utilize the unique talents of all your volunteers, right? How can you continue to distributize the work, to empower volunteers, to promote them, to let them bring their own unique skills and abilities into the room? That is all really important. And I'm going to pass it over to Coley.
All right, thank you, Hannah. So we just walked through the process to build one distributed volunteer team, the advanced call team. But here's a look at all of the different teams that we built out across our programs. So we use that 4-step process that Hannah just talked us through to launch all of the teams that you see on the screen right now. And each one was so necessary in powering the work of our national organizing program. Each team was part of this larger system that enabled us to accomplish our goals and do huge amounts of voter contact. Shayna, you can go to the next slide. So when you go to build your own distributed volunteer teams, again, the top principles that you're going to keep in mind are step 1, you know, being really clear about the discrete piece of work or problem that you're developing a distributed system in order to solve. Step 2, systematizing and automating workflows, creating responsibilities that are as efficient and consistent and repeatable as possible. And then the last 2 steps, you know, fueling those systems with volunteers, and then looking at your program from every angle to figure out what type of live training or written guides or support that those volunteers need in order to do the work. So it's important to always be asking yourself how those systems could adapt and improve, and how you can better sustain the enthusiasm and engagement of your volunteers.
Thank you very much. I guess that's very important, being transparent about the process, letting them know why it's important that this is being implemented, or why we're using these new platforms, and also allaying the fears or frustrations of people. And I think because we're going to try and innovate and implement these new models, I think that would be a very important reminder for a lot of us here, organizers and chapter and area leaders and allied organizations. Thank you very much for sharing the strategies, the tactics, and most importantly, the stories and experiences that you have. We are very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you very much, mga kasama, for tuning in. And we hope to see you in more of conversations like this.